I'm Jason Harmon, and this is API Intersection, where you'll get insights from experienced API practitioners to learn best practices on things like API design, governance, identity, auth, versioning, and more. All right. And thanks for everyone tuning in again to API Intersection podcast. Super stoked today. We've got Anna for co-hosting from Stoplight. And Anna, you
Hey
can
there.
tell us a little bit about yourself. And super exciting guest today with John Musser, old friend of mine. Been through a lot of different places and swap notes over the years. But John spent the last few years at Ford, and we're fascinated by the work he's done there. So I guess, Anna, give us a brief about yourself, and then John, you take a few minutes, kind of tell us where you're at.
Sure, I'm the product marketing manager at Stoplight. I get to work with Jason a lot, which is pretty fun. Um, I'm helping kind of tell our story in the marketplace, and I am very excited to talk to John because Jason and I were geeking out about being Ford families. My husband's family goes way back, and so we both drive matching Ford Fusions. So I'm very excited to talk
That's
about,
awesome. All right.
the opportunities of connected data and everything that you're doing at Ford.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. So, John, I guess, give us your kind of intro about a little bit about who you are for probably the handful of folks that don't already know.
The well, again, thanks for having me on the show. Um, so yes, I'm currently at Ford. I'm the director of engineering for Ford Pro, which is a new division focused on commercial customers, fleet customers. And we'll talk more about that later, I suspect. And I've been at Ford for 4 years, and I came to Ford having spent the last 30 years sort of in the in various parts of startups and big companies, and having founded programmable web in 2005, I spent the last 15 years in APIs in one way, shape, or form, right? And part of what was attractive to me at Ford was here's this industry that's going through this massive transformation of connectivity and electric vehicles and self-driving cars, and under the covers, so much of that is going to wind up being API and platform and ecosystem driven. Uh, so I've had an awesome time at Ford in a bunch of different roles, but part of the thread there is APIs.
Yeah. So, I think the bit that is probably like dusting off the cobwebs for you, but we're particularly interested in, certainly at Stoplight, and I know that's what people tend to listen to the podcast for, is kind of how API governance became a thing, and that sounded like that's kind of where you got started at Ford. And
Yeah.
how do we like bring order to this? And Ford's on the order of like 180,000 plus employees or something by last numbers I checked. So this is not a small scale operation, right?
Um, yeah, and of course you think of Ford as this vehicle manufacturing company that's been doing it for 118 years, and um, but behind the scenes, there's this large software engineering organization that keeps going larger, right? We're hiring, by the way, because it's becoming digitally enabled, right? So if you think about any large IT organization, a Fortune 500 company or Fortune 20 in this case, um, you have lots of teams that are building sort of API products across the organization. Some are public facing, some are internal, some are related to the car itself. Um, and so one of the things that when early on when I came to Ford, we were looking at doing some public facing APIs, and we've done some of that. But also we realized just how many internal APIs we had, and it was quite fragmented. So how do we go about bringing more order to that sort of chaos of the different teams? So we stood up a team called the Platform Enablement Team, and originally it was a small half a dozen people, and now it's closer to 100 people who are all focused on APIs across the company, right? In any part of Ford, so whether it's Ford Credit or the self-driving cars, sort of how do we start to do governance as one piece of it, and not heavy-handed sort of hammer type, but how do we how do we up level the whole organization? And we have the executive buy-in from the very top, so that you don't have to sell the idea of APIs or doing it well. Everybody's bought in. So then it comes down to, okay, how do we actually make that happen? So
Yeah, who
that team that we set up was focused on it.
who do you choose to be on that team, and what kind of skills do they bring to be part of the enablement team?
Yeah, it's a good question. So just like any sort of API teams, they have to be a bit multidisciplinary because you're going to need some engineering folks who are sort of down, understand building software, right? So some of those teams are actually building software. Others are doing um, uh, evangelism within the company, right? So they're out there, customer success solutions teams to kind of help other teams, you know, bring up their API level quality or how to get them into the right pipeline. Um, we have then there's some strategy teams looking at okay across this as we start to look at what we're building, what should we be building, what's going well, where do we need to change things, do we have any duplication? Any big company, you're naturally going to have some pockets of things that look similar. So how do we sort of rationalize some of that over time? Um, and some of the strategy, right, from top down corporate strategy and sort of tying into things happening in headquarters and sort of tying that together from a strategic perspective of um, uh, where should we put in more investment.
Yeah, I think it's one thing that stood out for me for Ford for the last few years. Very notable for me that we had, high level Ford execs coming to API conferences 5, 6 years ago talking about, the commitment to it. I think that's stood out for me that there's
Mm-hmm.
something different going on there. I would add a note here that, um, first of all, calling it enablement right out of the gate, like that's a thing we've heard, right? Like, don't do center of excellence, do enablement
Right.
model. I think starting with 6 people, definitely indicative of, start with a small group that's building, a broader kind of federated approach. And even at 100 people, I would just point out, we're talking a 0.5% of the population of the company. So still incredibly small. Granted, at, other companies, 100 might sound like a lot.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
so that's like ticking a lot of the boxes of things that we hear about what makes successful programs. I guess when you look at like, beyond the different kind of multidisciplinary roles involved, what were the primary things that you're looking at in terms of, what determines good APIs at Ford?
Well, first of all, so part of the question for any big company or even small one sometimes is, what APIs do you have? Like, what
Yeah.
do we got? Right? I'm
Mhm.
sure you see this all the time,
All
right?
the time.
Again, because so one of our initial work streams was API catalog, right? So we registered the internal domain of apicatalog.ford.com, set up, okay, so what are we going to start to build there as a go-to place that's, not a totally generic API catalog, but it has more substance that makes sense in our environment. Um, and then we started to add to that. So anyway, that's the catalog. Like, what do we got, right? So that's
And
part of
is that sort of a internal web-based portal that we're talking
yeah,
about,
it's
or
an
does
internal
catalog
web-based.
mean more than that?
Yep,
Okay.
but it's database backed, and part of what we think is really cool about it is that it's it helps answer a lot of questions that you run into on the inside, which are, whose API is this? Like, what team do I go to? Right? Who's the point of contact? Like, it seems easy, but that wasn't in there. Or does every team have an open API spec? Right? Do they have that consistency of like something that we can use as the input? Right? So we've started to sort of help teams do that. That's part of what's in there. Then you start looking at how are you going to get operational excellence, right? So this is another key area for us. Okay, so much more of the business depends on these. It becomes of all of millions of customers now use the Ford Pass app, right? So you buy a Ford car, you're going to use the Ford Pass mobile app on your iOS or Android device, right? And you want that thing to be reliable. And underneath the covers, it's using dozens and dozens of API calls, like any mobile app does. But we need to make sure that those are up, and so we put a lot of time and energy into, as every company does, like, oh wow, this is really important. We're gonna make sure this thing, we have these operational, behind the scenes pieces, making sure that those non-functional requirements are met. So in the API catalog, you can then tie into when if you were troubleshooting, the teams want to go look at it, you can see those metrics. You can tie it into those back end systems to see the charts and the performance metrics. So it isn't just here's a list of all the APIs, right? So someone may start there, and that's fine. You don't to get into the catalog. That's all you need, right? You just need to be. But as you start to grow in there, we start to enable teams to do more themselves and sort of do this loosely coupled API catalog. Um, Becomes this
And
cool, extensible, loosely tagged thing to go get other pieces of data elsewhere.
and at a high level, is this stuff like sort of SLA, SLO type definition,
Yeah,
or
yeah,
yeah, okay.
exactly.
And then I guess tying back to, I guess you've got to have some kind of environmental constructs to kind of tie back to various instances and things that get rolled up.
Yeah, again, it's what API gateways is it tied to, and also things like as product owners start to evolve their sort of API. As you know, API product ownership is different than other types of product ownership, right? And so we want to be very API product driven, platform driven as a company, and so using these tools and these platforms as a way to kind of enable and upskill all of us by default. So make doing the right thing the easy thing, right? And sort of baking in API metrics and sort of thinking about just not API traffic metrics, but what does that tie back to some business value? So again, growing that along the way. So API catalog was one, and I touched on another big work stream for us, which was metrics, right? Starting to both meta metrics around API, how many APIs do they have, what kind of APIs do we have, again across as we start to grow the catalog, right? So that we can see it both within a team and across teams, across organizations. So all those different taxonomies and sort of structures. So that was super helpful because then we get, here's where the again, it's the 80-20 rule. Where should we be investing more or less? What's working well? Error rates, those sorts of things. And then the third big work stream was that SRE, sort of DevOps, operational piece of the puzzle. And then the fourth big work stream was that evangelism and success for all the teams. And that's where a lot of the growth has been, going out to other teams and helping them
Got it.
get better.
So you mentioned that you had kind of all the executive buy-in and support for all this, which
Yeah.
is another hallmark of what we see is that's requisite for success. The band of rebels can only get so far, right? But I'm curious, presumably starting at 6 people with a few work streams, presumably borrowing people from elsewhere, whatever. Out of the gate, you're trying to build up like, how do I prove the value of this and get bigger investment? So tying it back to kind of like business outcomes, when you're looking at, okay, we'll have a catalog of APIs and have a better baseline of what our operational status is. How did that kind of net you further investment to get to now what you're talking about 100 people?
Low hanging fruit. So you show success, right? Like success builds on success. So you need to be able to say, okay, this is what we did with a scrappy little team, right? Here, look, we got our sort of V1 MVP catalog, right? Oh, look here, and then taking these up, and then putting one of the folks on the team was focused on the metrics piece, right? And we could show value there because when you take it up to the executive team, they understand numbers, they understand the histogram of what's happening over time, right? And so being able to iteratively, right, because you're not going to like come out with the right numbers or the most meaningful numbers out of the box, like iteratively, but take that up the chain, right? So go up to the quarterly executive meeting and sort of bring these in, right? So some of these, the data that the small scrappy team was collecting then got distributed around and got more attention, and then okay, well that's good, and then it leads to questions, right? Well, what about this and what about that? I don't understand what this means, and then using that to make that and get momentum, right?
Have you been incorporating tooling into these conversations, like even from the 6-member team all the way to the 100-member team? Have you had to bring tooling in for observability, or are you building your own metrics-based system?
Well, we should build it all ourselves, right?
No.
We don't build it all ourselves. No,
I
that'd be
didn't think so.
terrible.
That's why I asked.
Oh, ask me how I
No,
know.
yes, of course. Bad idea. But we have done, what we try to do is take off the shelf tools and then integrate them ourselves for where it makes sense for us, right?
For sure.
And so API gateways, right? We're not going to build an API gateway. So of course we big API gateway. Tools like the Splunks and the Datadogs and those sorts of things in the background for doing that. We've built some of our own observability layer in between, right? So we'll sort allow our application developers and our API developers to connect up to this lower level infrastructure in a way that's meaningful for tracking our transactions, right? Those sorts of that sort of glue, and again, gluing the API catalog to those backend systems. So trying to be smart and learning, right? So some things we tried and we're like, oh, we're gonna have to change that. But try and be, relatively agile about trying things out, seeing what works, and then building out this more sophisticated tool set. So yeah, a bunch of Postman we use, right? So again, so you
Mhm.
sort of look at each stage, whether it's uh, design, development, debugging, operational monitoring, publishing, right? So we then built tools around our API publishing pipeline that would allow disparate teams to publish to, say, an internal API gateway, which is in a different gateway structure than the external cloud-based API gateway. Um, but over time, we got to the point where here's the things you need to input. Um, I know, Jason, you and I talked about this before. Like linting is something that's sort of super important. How do you? We built our own API style guide, but if that's just a static thing that's sitting over on the side, it's much more easily sort of baked in, right? You can bake in success if you take the tools that you have and again make them easy for the developers, right? So developers like easy. They like to build on the shoulders of others. They don't always want to reinvent the wheel. So if you can if you can show them why it's in their own best interest to take these tools that you're giving them, it's like, oh look, I get diagnostics out of the box, or I avoided this security flaw, right?
Mhm.
And I didn't really have to do anything else because these other guys had already built this for us, and that's awesome.
Yeah,
Well, and
that's
what
why
we
I was.
keep seeing with the linting, and notably we have the Spectral open source project that is certainly pretty popular for this. And actually, I'll even pick on Arnaud Laurent a little bit in his talk at API Specs. It's like when you've taken all that basic stuff out of the way, you can have a conversation, right? Like you're not bogged down in does this convention match, and that security kind of stuff falls into the same bucket.
Yeah,
I know, like we had uh oh, I'm forgetting her first name, Monty from 42 Crunch on, and they have very much the same approach of like, let's catch everything on the left and save the pain on the right.
yeah,
So love that story.
yeah, yeah. And again, a lot of it is that shift left idea, right?
Yeah,
How do you how do you catch those things early and with the least amount of friction, right?
yeah,
And you don't have
totally.
to make it like all no, right? It can be just like a linter does. You can sort of warn
Yeah,
people or give them advice, right? It doesn't have to be like all stops here. I mean, security ones, okay, that's a different story. But again, so some of the other stuff could be sort of fed in.
yeah. Um, so shifting gears a little bit, there the obvious unique thing about talking to you working at Ford here is like the we always talk on the podcast about how do you set up your program, what are the things that work, that kind of stuff. I think you got a unique factor in that, there's big hunks of rolling steel out on the road by the millions that
Yeah,
that not only interact with some of these APIs but host some of them, from my understanding.
yeah,
So, like when you've thought about how to kind of do things, pervasively or consistent, how is that different in the car world versus kind of say building your back end systems or B2B
yeah,
integration or whatever?
yeah. I mean, cars are awesome, but they're definitely different when it comes to how are you gonna how are you gonna turn these things into these sort of digital phones on wheel, right? How are they gonna make this iPhone on wheels kind of? And I think um, because then you're like it's basically this mega IoT device, right?
Yeah,
Right. The car is this sort of composite, super composite IoT device that kind of dwarfs what's in your phone, right? The phone plus plus plus, right? Um, you know, these days there are minimum of 50 of these ECUs, it's electronic control units. They all have chips in them, which is why we have this sort of chip problem right now, because everything's got a computer in it, right? Uh, Everything is effectively within the vehicle. There's these the CAN bus and all these sort of lower level communication occurring across these devices, which have to happen in real time. Otherwise, your brakes or your engine don't work. Um, and so there's both the internal sort of effectively lower level APIs that have existed in the vehicle for years, for decades at this point. But they've been very isolated, right? These little silver boxes that kind of only talk to each other at a very low level. So um, both within Ford and across the industry, there's AUTOSAR, which is a standard around trying to abstract out what goes on across components, so that across suppliers and tier one and tier two and tier three suppliers that we all work with and work together. How do we start to rationalize more of how these communicate? Because we now all see that this is an industry-wide need. Um, and it's not just the API, right? It's also like the data elements, right? So it's what is in there, right? What's your what when you say fuel level? What do you mean by fuel level? Like when you say RPMs, what do you mean by that? And all sorts of other details. Um, so
But
that's in the
but
vehicle.
these levels of APIs that you're referring to, the low levels like your CAN bus or OBD, these are
Yeah.
like more programmatic interfaces, like not web APIs that we're talking about
These
at
are
that
not
layer,
RESTful
right?
web APIs, right?
Yeah.
But the goal is to continue to make them more, push those same principles, right? That we've adopted in the web, and sort of make those more common, right? The
Yep.
abstractions, and you'll never be the same because it's a different universe, right? It's real time. Um, and then, so that's the vehicle part, and we can talk more about that. But also safety critical, right?
Yeah.
So we as a company are very attuned to safety, right? This is safety and privacy are two of our guiding principles, right? So every time you talk about any of these conversations, safety and then ultimately privacy are part of this conversation. Then there's that next layer of vehicle to the cloud, right? So this sort of this connectivity layer of how, and sometimes people talk about this massive amount of data that's available from the vehicle, and you can get all this stuff from the and with any IoT scenario, and again here multiplied by 100x, one of your challenges is like that's too much data. Like I can't push that much data up to the cloud unless you want to bill the customer $1,000 a month for their connectivity bill. That's not going to fly, right? So you have to then think about, again, like in any edge computing or IoT environment, where do you apply the smarts? Where's the compute, right? So we're building more and more compute into the vehicle itself, right? Uh, Increasing both, the built-in compute, the bandwidth to grow it over time, because again, these vehicles, you don't want to bring it every 6 to 12 months to put a new CPU in there, right? You're not going to do that. So you kind of have to plan for a longer term and over-the-air updates, which we can talk about, right, in terms of being super critical. Um, but then there's that connectivity, right? So what do you expose both in terms of APIs and in general, part of what we've done on that front is in just over about 2 years ago, we had earlier invested in and ultimately acquired a company called Autonomic.ai in the Bay Area. And they were focused on, and they're core to what we do on the vehicle API side, taking all that low level binary hex data that's coming off all the CAN bus and 100 different ECUs, rationalizing that, pushing that back up to the cloud, and then making pretty JSON, RESTful APIs out of it above that, right? So for both us internally and for third parties, giving you that modern RESTful API above it, where you've done a lot of the dirty work and you've taken the diagnostic trouble codes and the 0x blah 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 and turned that into something meaningful, right? Um, that's a big chunk of what, for example, Autonomic AI is done within the Ford umbrella. We also refer to it as the Transportation Mobility Cloud, but that's what that does, right? So and across all the vehicles. And so I don't think in 2021 you can buy a Ford. I believe we've done it across the entire vehicle line. They all come with an embedded modem, right? A 4G modem.
Hmm.
So they come off the assembly line. Um, you as I say a retail customer have the ability to sort of say, well, I do want to use this, but um, there are a ton of advantages to using it, whether it's for Ford Pass and all these other things.
Yeah, and Ford Pass for listeners, and I know Anna, because you're also Ford family here, but like my use cases that are super common are like I can tell whether or not I need air in the tires and be alerted of it without even being in the vehicle, notified of when oil changes are coming up. So like totally meaningful here that all this sensor level data being fed up to cloud so that it can be
Yeah,
integrated on my phone has a huge consumer impact.
and you did mention one of the other sort of very often used features, and it varies by season. It's kind of interesting to learn the seasonality to it. Remote start,
Oh yeah,
Hmm.
yeah,
right?
I'm in
So you can
Detroit.
sit there in your
Big one
mobile,
for us.
yeah.
you
Let's
know,
say I live in
season,
Texas, so I don't talk about it, and I probably use it all the time.
right?
Yep.
From a season perspective, right? You certainly, again, in the wintertime, it's so much nicer to be able to go out to a nice warm vehicle, right? Um,
Mhm.
and all you have to do is push a button in your app, and the car starts warming up for you, right?
Yeah. For what
Or
it's worth,
cooling or
we
cooling
our,
down.
our seasonality in Texas is we use it in the middle of the summer, so
I was
I've
going
been
to say,
using
right,
it
exactly.
recently.
You're the other end.
Yeah.
Yeah, again, we look at the numbers as there are dips in the edge seasons, certainly North
Yep,
America,
makes
but
sense.
um, and then I think I don't just to to expand on that, right? So those same APIs, for example, that can help you locate where your vehicle is, start your vehicle, see the fuel level or the air pressure level, right? So those are all there for go to the Ford Pass app, but like with any good API, it's there, right? So therefore, what other things can be done, with it? We use it for other things internally, but then also with partners, right? So from an ecosystem, a good API program, and we certainly see it this way as enabling, new services. So um, just over a year ago, one of the things that we did on the retail side was partnered with Amazon. So when you order packages on Amazon, you can have those packages delivered to your vehicle, right?
Hmm.
Oh,
So instead of saying, "Oh, here's my home address," you can say, "Well, you have to, of course, go through a few authorization steps to make this all happen. But once you've done that, the Amazon driver can come and deliver it to the trunk of your car, so you can be at work or wherever, somewhere on the road, and it's all done in a very secure manner." And it can pop the trunk and turn off the alarm, and then it turns that alarm back on when they leave. So it's a seamless way to use your car as another delivery address, right? But it's using the same. It was super cool, and it's the same APIs.
yeah. I'm actually sitting here flipping around, looking at it while you're talking about it. I'm like, ooh, pop open
Applications
the bed of my
for
truck. I already got the cover on there.
grocery
Right.
delivery.
Right.
I have to
Just
use that.
every
Well,
application is very
exactly.
cool.
So, and there are a bunch of startups, right, and bigger companies
Hmm.
thinking about all the different things you can do now that the cars and
Hmm.
vehicles are connected, right?
Yep.
So there's fuel delivery, right? And you may have
Hmm.
seen there's a number of fuel delivery startups, and Big Oil's looking at this as well, like how we could. It's not, some states allow it, some don't. But again, bringing the fuel to your car, so just like you would have your or laundry delivery, right, or any of those things. If the car is digitally addressable in a secure way, and you opt into that, bunch
Look,
of
a car is such a fundamental part of
new
your life,
opportunities.
right? So it makes
Yeah.
sense that it becomes so ingrained in your day-to-day activities that it becomes a new postal box even, or a new place to engage with some of the services you use every single day. That's so fascinating.
Yeah,
Yep.
and
Yeah.
it kind of like the light bulb has to go off, right?
Yeah,
Because
the
like, oh
the
yeah,
light
that's
bulb
right.
goes
I
off.
never really
Yeah.
thought about it. Oh wait, it's another thing. Yeah, okay. So that's where kind of where the early days where we are, right? Which kind of makes it so exciting, like so early.
So I guess bringing this back to, kind of these big overarching, like how does Ford build with better operational excellence and APIs and presumably higher quality and better innovation? Looking at how these kind of, you know, web APIs are getting designed for cars versus the internal services, are there commonalities between those things, or are they so different that you have like completely bespoke set of rules for each?
Good question. They historically were so different, right? I think what we're trying to do over time is start to bring those closer together. They'll never be the same, right? But for example, by abstracting the differences in different, headlights across cars and different, so you start to build these abstraction layers in the vehicle, and then think about the APIs and data around them, um, and then over time start to then they open up those opportunities that you didn't have before, right? So to make it a bit closer to what you see in the cloud. And again, we'll always have that. You're always going to have that layer to sort of translate the two at
Hmm.
some point. But the
Yeah.
closer that they look, the better, right?
Yeah. Having tinkered with CAN bus stuff before, I would be extremely grateful to not have to touch it.
Right? Because the OBD2, which is that standard for plugging into the vehicle. I
Yep.
mean, if you're a car hacking geek, that's like second nature to you. But to
Oh yeah.
anybody else, it's like, what? What is that? It's like
Yeah.
it's all just because it is all like this, scary hex stuff, and like,
Yeah.
whoa,
Well, and
right?
CAN bus is like a globalized version of the onboard diagnostics. Anyways, car geeking aside,
Yeah,
um, the so I mean, what you're kind of describing is this sort of common models that are applicable across all things. So, like you mentioned, headlights, like trying to find there's one way that we describe a headlights. We have one representation for that. It should be true whether you're looking at some backend system or you're, interacting with these kind of vehicle centric APIs. Is that about right?
yep,
Cool. Yeah.
yep.
Another recurring theme of, find your common models and be consistent across all your channels. So it's really cool to see that that can even apply to, like, I like your description, like a giant IoT device.
Hmm.
Very cool.
And again, I sort of come back to um, principles around security and privacy, right? Because
Hmm.
I think there are natural concerns around those, and so that's why for no OEM, no auto manufacturer, you're going to see this grand open API program right now because it you have to be so careful about those things, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so as owners, you're afraid of that, right? Because it's connected. It's like, oh, whether it's again the quality of the software, both built internally, but also again hackers and anything else that might go wrong, right? You just have to be really, focused on that. And again, from a privacy perspective, again, that's a very private piece of information you have around um, where you go and any of that, right? So, we're
Yeah.
very careful about respecting those fundamental principles.
We dabbled in a obviously a much smaller sphere of that when I was at UShip many years back on starting to add location services to the app when we had truckers delivering things. And it's like you gotta just have this constant cultural reminder that, like, we have a full accounting of everywhere this person's been. This
Yeah,
is, this is life changing data in the wrong hands.
yeah,
So I can't even fathom what that's like at the scale you guys are working
yeah.
on globally.
That's
It
why
makes sense
it's a
that
priority.
OEMs aren't really taking on that challenge, and that partnerships are so important to your business model right now because you need a good partnership that knows how to handle those security concerns, that you don't have to worry about that data falling out into the wrong hands. But that means that your APIs for those partnerships have to be easy, right? Because how else do
Yeah,
you open up opportunities unless you are creating APIs that your partners can use? So it goes all the way from the car all the way up, right, into the business.
yeah, right. And then easy also means the documentation. So going back to your
Yep.
earlier question around who's on the team, right? Um, because you need people who know how to do that well, right? You need that developer experience and API docs and getting started guides and whatever tooling you might need around that to make that experience, both for our internal teams and for our partners, um, you work well, right?
Hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Doesn't just happen by magic. If only you could wave your
Nope.
hand and make it happen by magic. Doesn't
All of our
It's not that
customers wish the
easy.
same thing. That's what Stoplight is for.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I understand.
So, from us chatting before, it sounds like you're kind of shifting gears into more of this Ford Pro, kind of the uh, fleet management aspect of things. Um, where do you see that kind of space, moving toward around kind of the usage of the APIs? You mentioned before, just having them in the vehicles is a hell of a starting point, but
Yeah.
what are the kinds of opportunities that's going to open up?
Um, and I think it's a good topic. And I realize one thing we didn't touch on, so I want to interject one
Mhm.
other sort of piece of my time at Ford, where I just was coming out of, which is
Oh
the
yeah, of
self-driving
course.
cars, right?
Yeah.
um, and that's overall farther down the road, but we're working on it now, right? And so self-driving cars are APIs all the way down, right? Like so, whether we've invested heavily in a company out of in the Pittsburgh area called Argo.ai, and Argo is providing all of that you know deep AI around how to actually do the driving, itself. And we're running pilot tests in Miami and DC, and Detroit and other cities as we gradually start to run these pilot programs for self-driving cars. But again, you can't do um, it's all those same things, but at a whole nother level, right? Because it's still APIs under the covers, um, uh, and even more so, right? So the Ford APIs talk to Argo APIs in this case in the vehicle, and you have to be more attuned to how well does all that compute infrastructure work in a disconnected scenario, because you can't always rely on connectivity, but yet the car is there running itself. Um, so it's another place in which APIs are super important. API tooling is super important. Governance, right? Doing it well, being secure, quality APIs, multi-party APIs, right? So again, sort of it's an ecosystem to actually make that work. So I think in the future, as when you hear and see more sort of self-driving cars out there, just keep in the back of your mind that self-driving car is driven by APIs.
Hmm.
Um, so um,
Well, I think maybe that's our teaser there. When I ask about Pro, you start talking about autonomous.
yes.
Should I take the hint?
No. So that's so for for Ford, we have the other inflection point right before there. So some of the big inflection points right now are connectivity, right? So all the vehicles are connected. Electrification, right? So electrification is this, again, Ford announced just last week, an $11 billion investment in these new, you know, U.S. based EV battery and vehicle manufacturing plants, and so that's potentially one of our biggest investments ever, right? So it's around EVs, but EVs are all connected, right? That you don't have a not connected
Yeah.
EV, right? These things build on each other, and then farther down the road, you're going to have the AVs, right? So this is part of that, you know, longer term when you sort of look over the course of time, when you think about cars over the next 5 to 10 years, this is where it's going, right? So it's connected vehicles, electric vehicles, self-driving vehicles, right? Um, uh, and then you have these mobility services built on top. So coming back to the Pro question, circuitous route, um, all of, if you're a commercial vehicle, like we all individually, I suspect a lot of folks listening on the, on the podcast here, you have a car, whether it's a Ford car or another one, you think about your experience as a single owner, but, there are fleet owners that have anything from 2,000 vehicles or more. Uh, And if you extrapolate what it means to be connected, electric, API driven platforms, there's a whole, like, a huge opportunity to build some really valuable services on top of that, right? So that's, back in the spring, Ford announced a whole new division with its own CEO. Focus solely because we have such a lion's share and such a core competency around the commercial vehicle space as effectively the leader in that space with transit vans, pickup trucks, chassis, upfit custom vehicles, police vehicles. We have the lion's share of the police vehicle
Hmm.
market. Uh, so the commercial space is huge, and it's a core competency of ours. And so doubling down on that strength, now that they are all going to be connected, um, let's start to give our customers, our commercial customers, a whole new set of options that they didn't have previously. So that's what this new division that we're just spinning up now, and that's where I just joined that group to help lead some of the engineering efforts over there.
Well, and it's I
That's
can't
huge.
help but observe along that same timeline. That's roughly as this new Ford Lightning full electric kind of EV truck is coming to market. I'd have to imagine that's the confluence
Yeah.
of all those capabilities, right?
Exactly. Yeah, the two big ones that are coming up in the next 12 months are later this year, early next year is the e-transit. So it's that
Mm,
transit van. Um, and again, as someone managing a fleet, you become much more conscious around cost, right? Uptime. Every time that thing's in a shop, that's costing you money. So thinking about how can you use these digital services to maximize your uptime, reduce your cost, best utilize that fleet? Once they're electric, how do I optimize that? And that's giving me another chance to both. It's on the one hand maybe a complication, but on the other hand it's an opportunity, right? Um, and so again, building this entire digital layer for that business is key to what Ford Pro will be about.
And how to enable the different locations to have infrastructure. So you're going to need electric vehicle places to charge. You're going to need dealerships that are be able to service those individual, electric and autonomous vehicles.
Yep.
They're not prepared yet for that kind of work, right? So you need to be able to lay the
Right.
foundations to enable those places to have your inventory.
Yeah, and that's a great point because we just acquired a really cool company, a Bay Area company called Electrify.ai this summer, so in July. And their focus was on helping fleet owners manage this sort of depots and charging, and they have some really cool tools around that. So that'll be integrated into our into our overall offering. Um,
That's
and
awesome.
again, I think it's a huge opportunity. And again, always APIs under the covers. Oh, even if the API is not in the story, there's an API in there somewhere.
So I guess the read between the lines tip here is if you're in a auto-oriented startup and you want to be acquired by Ford, make sure it ends in .ai, right?
It doesn't hurt. Yeah. I think all the other .coms are taken anyway. So
Yeah, that's probably true.
you do .io as well would probably fly. Yeah.
All
The
right. Well, I guess it feels like a pretty good point to wrap. I think, got through a lot of the high level subjects we were looking for. I guess I always want to kind of bring it back to, knowing we have listeners who hear all this big complex stuff and go, well, you have massive resources and all these things to throw at it. But maybe, I'm a team of one or a small team or a small company. Like, where would I get started? If I don't have all those resources and have to deal with all that complexity and, moving in the same direction Ford is with investing big in APIs and seeing innovation and quality increase.
um, Well, yeah, similarly, we try to start small, right? So I think even though we're huge, right? Even just like that platform enablement team was another example of where we try to be small and focused, and go from there, right? So I think it's not necessarily a disadvantage, right? And then thinking about um, you know how am I baking in API thinking, platform thinking from the beginning? So even in my small couple man shop, how do I think about sort of APIs and platforms being core to what I'm doing, and having that sort of set of, again, tools to help you do it, right? Because you don't have to reinvent the wheel. So there's a bunch of both commercial and open source tools for developers now that didn't exist 2, 5, 10 years ago. So you know, just like going to GitHub, I think part of what's in your thinking is like, how can I leverage this to accelerate what I'm trying to do, right? Because there's more tooling all the time, and that helps with the speed and complexity and the gotchas, right? And so it's not those are super accelerators, right? Tools can be accelerators.
Yeah. Well said. Well, John, really appreciate you taking the time. This has definitely been a different one, right? Talking car stuff so much, but being a dyed in the wool car guy. And I mean, my dad worked at a dealership for 20 years fixing Fords, right? I grew up with it. So
Yeah,
definitely
yeah,
cool to get to geek out on that. But I think also
yeah,
just to wrap our heads around the scale you guys are dealing with and really the world changing effects of some of these things. It's feels like a really interesting time to talk about it.
yeah. And thanks for having me on. It's been fun to chat about it and geek out, and we can always do it again. I'm sure there'll be more to talk about another time. Also, we're hiring, so if any of this sounds interesting, um, you know, there's 4 jobs online. You can come and sort of see. We need all the same skill sets, right? All these sort of software related folks. We certainly, we're definitely hiring. So and it's an exciting time to be in this space. So.
No question.
Yeah.
Well, and I should also thank Anna for stepping up to help co-host again. And I guess with that, we'll say goodbye, listeners. So make sure and go check out Ford Jobs Online. Right? That sounds like our call to action here at the end. So thanks everyone for listening. Thanks for listening. If you have a question you want to ask, look in the description of whichever platform you're viewing or listening on, and there should be a link there so you can go submit a question, and we'll do our best to find out the right answer for you.